never believed in ghost stories. Not really. Even growing up in a small Appalachian town where every old house had a haunting, I always figured there was a logical explanation for everything. That was until I lost my brother, Mark. He disappeared without a trace 3 years ago. Mark was an outdoorsman, the kind of guy who could navigate a forest without a compass, build a fire from scratch, and tell which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. Every year, he spent a weekend at our family's old lakeside cabin at Black Hollow Lake. It was a secluded place, nestled deep in the woods with no cell service, just a single, winding dirt road leading in and out. One October, Mark went up for his annual solo trip. He was supposed to be back on Sunday evening. But Sunday came and went, and no sign of him. No calls, no texts. Monday morning, I drove up to the cabin, expecting to find him nursing a hangover, laughing at my concern. What I found instead made my stomach turn. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold autumn wind. Inside, the fireplace was cold, his duffel bag still packed near the bed. His truck was parked outside, keys still in the ignition. Nothing looked out of place except for one thing. Mark's boots sat perfectly at the edge of the dock, as if he had taken them off just before stepping into the water. But the lake was silent, so still it reflected the sky like a mirror. I called the police and a full search began. Divers combed the murky waters, helicopters scanned the surrounding forest, and dozens of volunteers trudged through the woods. They found nothing. No body, no footprints leading away. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Days turned into weeks and then months. The official story was that he had drowned, but I never believed it. My brother was a strong swimmer, and the lake was shallow near the dock. If he had drowned, they would have found him. But they never did. 3 years later, I returned to Black Hollow Lake for the first time since his disappearance. I needed closure. I needed to understand. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. Everything was exactly as we had left it. Abandoned, untouched. But something felt wrong. That night, as I lay in the creaking bed, I heard it. A faint splashing sound coming from the lake. Slow, rhythmic, like footsteps in the water. I lay frozen in the cabin's creaking bed, listening. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate splashes, as if someone were walking through the lake. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. The water near the dock was at least 6 feet deep. No one should be able to walk there. My body screamed at me to stay put, to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something deeper, a pull I couldn't explain, forced me to move. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the window overlooking the lake. The dock was empty, but the splashing continued. I hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the porch. The air was thick with damp, decaying leaves. The flashlight flickered weakly as I aimed it toward the water. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not on the dock. On the water. Dark, wet imprints appeared, one after the other, leading away from the dock as if someone had walked straight out onto the lake's glassy surface. I felt bile rise in my throat. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. Then, from the middle of the lake I heard it. Jake! My name. A whisper. A voice I knew. Mark's voice. I staggered back, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But the footprints. They were still appearing, closer now. I bolted inside, slamming the door and locking it. My heart pounded against my ribs as I backed away, but my eyes were drawn to the window. The footprints had stopped, right at the edge of the dock. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the cabin, flashlight gripped in my trembling hands, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I had just seen. But nothing came. By morning, the footprints were gone, but the feeling remained. A cold, sinking certainty deep in my bones. My brother had never left this place, and whatever had taken him was still here. By morning, the footprints were gone. The lake was still again, reflecting the sky with unnatural clarity. If not for the lingering chill in my bones, I might have convinced myself it had all been a dream. But I knew better. Mark was out there. I needed answers. After forcing down a few bites of stale granola, I made my way to the dock. My boots thudded against the old wooden planks, the sound too loud in the quiet. The water lapped gently against the posts, betraying no sign of what had happened the night before. But something was different. A single object rested at the dock's edge. A notebook. I recognized it instantly. Mark's leather-bound journal. The one he took everywhere, filling its pages with sketches, survival notes, and idle thoughts. I had searched for it after he disappeared, but it had never been found. And now, here it was, dry and undamaged, as if it had been placed there just moments before. I swallowed hard and picked it up. The first few pages were normal, his neat, slanted handwriting detailing his trip. Arrived at the cabin around 4 p.m. Weather's good. Should be a quiet weekend. Checked the generator. Needs maintenance soon. Made a fire and had some whiskey. The stars are incredible out here. Then, the entries changed. The handwriting grew shaky. Something is wrong. Heard splashing outside last night. Thought it was a deer, but there were footprints leading into the water. Saw something in the lake. A shape. It's deep out there, but I swear it was standing just beneath the surface, looking up at me. I keep hearing my name, in my own voice. I turned the page and my blood ran cold. The last entry was scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. IT wants me to come closer. IT knows my name. I can see it now, reflected in the water. But when I look up, the sentence ended abruptly, the ink smeared. My breath came in shallow gasps. Mark had known something was watching him, calling to him, and now it was calling to me. A ripple spread across the lake. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But I did, and I saw it. A shadow beneath the water, just below the dock. A face, pale, blurred by the rippling surface. Mark. His eyes locked onto mine. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. His hand reached up, and the water split open. Something dragged me down. The water closed over me like a fist. Cold, crushing, suffocating. I thrashed, but something held me down. Fingers, wet, skeletal fingers, dug into my arms, pulling me deeper. My lungs screamed for air. My vision blurred, dark shapes swirling in the abyss below. And then, I saw them. Bodies, suspended in the dark, their forms twisting just beneath the surface. Faces pale and distorted, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes, empty sockets, turned toward me as if they could still see. One of them was Mark. He reached for me, lips forming soundless words. Don't fight. Panicked. My chest burned. My limbs flailed against the thing dragging me down. I couldn't die like this. I wouldn't. With the last of my strength, I kicked upward. My fingers scraped something, the dock, and I latched on, pulling myself free from the grasping hands below. My head broke the surface, and I gasped in lungfuls of air. I dragged myself onto the dock, coughing up water, body shaking. But before I could move, I heard it, a whisper, right behind me. You should have stayed. I spun around. The lake was still again, the reflection of the sky unbroken. But beneath the water, just at the edge of my vision, something watched me. And then, slowly, it sank into the depths. I stumbled back, running toward the cabin. I didn't stop to pack, didn't stop to think. I just ran. I jumped into my truck, gunning the engine, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I never went back. But sometimes at night I still hear it. A voice whispering from the dark. My brother's voice, calling my name. The last time anyone saw Daniel Holt, he was walking down Millhaven Road, a stretch of cracked pavement that cut through the dense New England woods. It was late, around 10:45 p.m. A witness, an elderly woman named Margaret Lane, said she saw him from her porch as he passed under the glow of a flickering street lamp. She looked away for a moment, just 1 second, to sip her tea. When she looked back, Daniel was gone. Not a single footprint. No sound. Just vanished. The police searched for weeks. combing through the forest, dragging the nearby river, questioning every local. But there was no sign of him. No body. No belongings. It was like he had never existed. Daniel Holt wasn't the kind of guy who just disappeared. He was a straight-laced accountant, a creature of habit. He left his office at exactly 6 p.m. every night, ate dinner at the same diner, and walked the same route home. There was no reason for him to run away. Yet, as I dug deeper into his case, something didn't sit right. I'm Elliot Graves, a journalist specializing in missing person cases, and I came across Daniel's file by accident, a name buried in an old, unsolved disappearances database. No media attention, no major investigations, just a few police reports gathering dust. But here's where it gets strange. Daniel Holt wasn't the first person to disappear on Millhaven Road. In fact, he was the sixth. Every 5 to 6 years, someone vanished in the exact same spot. Always at night, always without a trace. No bodies were ever recovered. No one ever turned up later. It was as if the road itself swallowed them whole. So, I did what any rational person wouldn't. I went there myself. It was a cold October evening when I arrived at Millhaven Road. The air smelled of damp leaves, the kind of thick, wooded silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I parked my car near the last known location where Daniel had been seen and started walking. The street lamps buzzed overhead, casting pale yellow light over the cracked asphalt. The trees loomed on either side, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. And then I saw it, the street lamp where Daniel had last been seen. It flickered weakly, its glow barely illuminating the ground beneath it. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. Then my flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed me whole. The air changed heavy, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Then, from the shadows I heard a voice. A whisper. Turn around. My breath hitched. The voice was Daniel Holt's. My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable, Daniel Holt's. But that was impossible. He had been missing for 7 years. I stood frozen beneath the flickering street lamp, my breath clouding in the icy air. Turn around. The whisper came again, closer this time. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my useless flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the journalist in me wouldn't let go. I had come here to find answers, and now I was standing in the middle of something I didn't understand. Slowly, I turned. The road stretched into darkness, silent and empty. The only movement came from the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. But I could feel it, something just beyond my sight, watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, not a man, not exactly. More like a shadow, standing just outside the reach of the street lamp's dying glow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its edges shifting like smoke. And then it moved, not like a person, not like anything human. One moment it was distant, the next it was closer, too close. The air turned to ice. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, my ears ringing like I was standing near an explosion. The trees blurred, the road beneath my feet felt wrong, as if it wasn't really there. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when I heard it again. Help me. This time, the voice wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from behind me. I spun around and found myself standing on a completely different road. The street lamp was gone. My car was gone. Even the forest had disappeared. I wasn't on Millhaven Road anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Panic gripped my chest. The road beneath my feet was wrong. A cracked, crumbling path that stretched endlessly in both directions, vanishing into a thick, colorless fog. The air was still, oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. This was not Millhaven Road. It wasn't any road I knew. I turned in a slow circle, my heart pounding. No cars. No sounds. No sky, just a dim, suffocating void overhead. That's when I saw the footprints. A single set of them, leading away into the fog. And they were fresh. I swallowed, my mouth dry as sandpaper. Against all logic, I started following them. Every step felt like walking through water, like something unseen was pushing against me. My own footprints didn't leave marks behind. After what felt like an eternity, a shape emerged from the fog. A house. No, not a house. A ruin. It was a decayed, skeletal thing, leaning like it had been abandoned for centuries. The windows were shattered, the wooden siding warped and blackened. A single door stood open, swaying slightly despite the motionless air. A terrible thought crept into my mind. Had Daniel Holt come here? Was he still here? The footprints led inside. My fingers curled into fists. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to run, to pretend I had never seen this place. But I had no choice. I stepped through the door. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The walls were peeling, covered in deep scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at them for years. A broken chair sat in the middle of the room, and beside it, a notebook. I picked it up with trembling hands, flipping through the pages. Daniel Holt's handwriting. The entries were frantic, uneven, growing more unhinged with each page. I don't know where I am. The road disappeared. There's no way back. There's always fog. Always this house. I hear voices at night. They call my name. But when I look, there's nothing there. I think I'm not alone here. I think IT knows I'm here. If you find this, you need to leave. You need to run. You need to. The last sentence was cut off. The ink smudged. The final page was torn out. A sudden creak echoed above me. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the second floor. Someone else was in the house. Or worse, something was. The footsteps above me stopped. Silence swallowed the house, thick and unnatural. I stood frozen in place, Daniel Holt's notebook clenched in my shaking hands. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. Something was upstairs. Something that wasn't human. I wanted to run. I should have run. But instead, my body moved on instinct. I took a slow step toward the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I climbed. The air grew colder the higher I went, each breath fogging in front of me. My flashlight was still dead, leaving only the faint, eerie glow from the broken windows to guide me. The hallway at the top was narrow, lined with doors that hung open like gaping mouths. The walls were covered in the same deep scratches I had seen downstairs, long, jagged gouges carved by something with claws. Then, from the last door on the right, a whisper. Elliot. I nearly dropped the notebook. It knew my name. I inched closer, my back pressed against the wall. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark room beyond. The air inside was different, thicker, like something was pressing against reality itself. I pushed the door open, and there, in the corner of the room, stood Daniel Holt, or what was left of him. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and wide with a terror that hadn't faded, even in death. His lips were cracked, moving silently, like he was still trying to scream. And behind him, the shadow. It rose from the darkness like a living void, its shape twisting and shifting, tendrils of blackness writhing like they were alive. Its face was featureless, except for a wide, gaping hole where a mouth should have been. The moment I saw it, my head split with pain. A wave of nausea crashed over me. My vision blurred, the room spinning as a deep, guttural sound rumbled from the shadow's throat. Not a growl, not a whisper, but something far worse. It was speaking, not in words. Impure, un filter d'horror. Daniel's body lurched forward, his movements unnatural, like a marionette on broken strings. His mouth stretched open too wide, and from it came a voice that was no longer his. You shouldn't be here. The shadow moved. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. My body acted on pure survival instinct, sprinting down the stairs, bursting through the front door, and racing into the fog. The house vanished behind me, swallowed by the endless nothingness. And then, the world shifted. I stumbled, nearly falling onto the pavement. But when I looked up, I was back. Millhaven Road. The street lamp still flickered weakly overhead. My car sat untouched where I had parked it. The fog was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the night, like nothing had happened. like I had never left. But as I stood there, gasping for breath, I felt something in my pocket. A piece of torn paper. I pulled it out with shaking hands. The missing final page from Daniel Holt's notebook. Scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting were 4 words. "It let me go." I drive for a living. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Late-night shifts, endless highways, strangers in the back seat. Nothing surprises me anymore. At least that's what I thought. Then I picked up Clara Reynolds, and she disappeared from my car without a trace. It was a Friday night just past midnight when the request came in. A pickup from a bar outside of town. I pulled up outside, a dimly lit dive called Jack's Tavern, and waited. That's when I saw her. A woman in her late 20s, standing alone beneath the neon glow of the open sign. Clara Reynolds. She was dressed in a black coat, her blonde hair falling over her face as she scrolled through her phone. She slid into the back seat without a word, shutting the door behind her. "Clara?" I asked. She nodded, eyes still on her phone. Her drop-off location was Riverside Apartments, about 20 minutes away. Easy ride. I pulled out onto the road, the night stretching ahead in long, empty miles. For a while, we drove in silence. Then, at a red light, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Clara was staring straight ahead, her phone untouched on her lap. Something about the way she sat, stiff, motionless, sent a chill through me. "You okay back there?" I asked. She didn't react at first. Then, without looking at me, she murmured, "He's following me." A spike of unease crawled up my spine. I checked my mirrors. The road behind us was empty. "Who?" I asked carefully. She didn't answer. I told myself she was just drunk. Maybe paranoid. I'd had plenty of passengers like that before. But something about the way she said it, like she knew something I didn't. A few minutes later, we reached the Riverside Apartments. I pulled into the parking lot and put the car in park. "All right, here we are." No response. I turned around. The back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. No sound, no movement, nothing. Clara Reynolds was gone. Vanished, like she had never been there at all. My breath caught in my throat. The back seat was empty. No doors had opened.
No sounds.
No movement. Clara Reynolds was just gone. For a few long seconds, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe she had slipped out when I wasn't looking? But how? I had watched the road the entire time. I got out of the car, scanning the parking lot. No one. Just the dim glow of flickering streetlights and the distant hum of traffic. I even checked the back seat, as if she might still be there, somehow. Nothing. A cold, creeping dread settled over me. Something about this wasn't just strange, it was wrong. I opened my rideshare app and checked my trip history. Clara Reynolds. Picked up at 12:03 a.m. Dropped off at 12:27 a.m. It showed the ride as completed. So why did it feel like I had driven that last stretch of road alone? I barely slept that night. The next morning, I searched for her name online. Maybe she was reported missing. Maybe I could find something, anything, to prove she was real. What I found was worse. Clara Reynolds had gone missing 5 years ago. Vanished without a trace after leaving Jack's Tavern. Last seen getting into a car, a rideshare just like mine. She was never found. My stomach twisted. The article had a photo, the same woman who had been in my backseat. Same blonde hair. Same black coat. I checked my app again, heart pounding. The trip was gone. Erased. Like Clara Reynolds had never been there at all. I stared at my phone screen, my stomach twisting into knots. The trip record gone. No sign that I had ever picked up Clara Reynolds. No record of the ride, no payment, no trip history. It was like it had never happened. But I knew she had been in my car. I could still hear her voice. "He's following me." I could still see her in the rearview mirror, her blank, staring eyes. I needed answers. So, against every instinct telling me to drop this and forget it ever happened, I drove back to Jack's Tavern. The bar was nearly empty when I walked in. The air smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke. An older bartender wiped down the counter, barely looking up as I approached. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you remember a woman named Clara Reynolds?" His hand froze mid-wipe. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze to mine. His eyes were wary. "Why are you asking?" I hesitated. I think I stopped myself. I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. "I heard she used to come here." The bartender exhaled sharply, tossing the rag aside. "Yeah, she was a regular. Sweet girl. One night, she left here and never made it home." He shook his head. "Damn shame. Did she leave alone?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, took a rideshare. Just like she always did." My throat went dry. "Did they ever find out who picked her up?" His expression darkened. "They tried, but the trip record vanished. The driver swore he never picked her up, that there was some kind of glitch. But—" He hesitated. "I saw her get in the car. She was there. And then she wasn't." A chill ran down my spine. "You mean she disappeared from the car?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bartender's eyes met mine, dead serious. "She never got out." A long silence stretched between us. Then, from behind me, a whisper. "He's following me." My breath hitched. I spun around and saw Clara Reynolds standing at the door. Clara Reynolds stood in the doorway of Jack's Tavern. Her blonde hair hung limp over her face. Her black coat clung to her thin frame. But it was her eyes that sent ice through my veins. Wide, unblinking. Like she wasn't really seeing me at all. Or like she was seeing something else entirely. The bartender stiffened behind me. "No way," he muttered, stepping back. "No goddamn way." I swallowed hard. "Clara?" She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He's here." The lights flickered. A deep, suffocating cold filled the room. The bottles behind the bar rattled against the shelves. I turned toward the bartender. "What the hell is happening?" But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking past me, and his face had gone pale with terror. I didn't want to turn around, but I did, and I saw him, a man in a dark suit, standing in the middle of the bar. His face was wrong, blurred like a photograph taken in motion. His eyes were just black holes swallowing the light around them. He wasn't there a second ago. He hadn't entered. He had just appeared. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The bartender ran, bolting through the back door without another word. Clara didn't move. Neither did the man in the suit. Then he took a step toward me. The air turned thick, pressing against my lungs. My vision wavered, like the entire world around me was coming apart. A deep, rumbling voice filled my head. "You should not have followed." The room shattered, and I was somewhere else. I gasped, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I was back in my car, back on the road. The streetlights glowed dimly, the world silent except for the distant hum of traffic. My rideshare app was open on my phone, a completed trip flashing on the screen. Clara Reynolds. Dropped off at 12:27 a.m. Like nothing had happened. Like I had never left. But as I stared at the screen, one last notification popped up. A new request. Pickup from Jack's Tavern. And the name on the screen, Clara Reynolds. Every town has its ghost stories. In my hometown, that story was about David Mercer, the boy who walked into the fog and was never seen again. It happened on October 12, 1998, in a place called Pine Hollow, a dense stretch of woods at the edge of town. David, 11 years old, was last seen riding his bike down Old Creek Road. His parents said he was on his way to a friend's house, but he never arrived. A massive search followed. Police, volunteers, search dogs, combing every inch of the woods. They found his bike, toppled over on the side of the road. His backpack neatly placed against a tree. But no David. The only clue? A witness. A local hunter. swore he saw the boy walking into the fog that had rolled over Pine Hollow that afternoon. It was strange, he told reporters. The fog just sat there like a wall, and he walked straight in. I expected to see him come out the other side, but he never did. David Mercer was never found. His case became a legend, a cautionary tale kids whispered about during sleepovers. Don't go into Pine Hollow when the fog rolls in, they'd say, or you'll never come back. I never believed in ghost stories, but that changed the night David Mercer came back. I never believed the stories about Pine Hollow. Even growing up in the same town where David Mercer vanished, I always figured there was a rational explanation. Maybe he was kidnapped. Maybe he ran away. Maybe the fog confused the search teams, and they just missed something. But then, on October 12, 2023, exactly 25 years later, David Mercer came back. I was working the late shift at Grady's gas station, a rundown little place just a few miles from Pine Hollow. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was in the middle of stocking shelves when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I turned, expecting another drunk college kid looking for snacks. Instead, I saw him, a boy, no older than 11, standing there in the doorway, his clothes damp with morning dew, like he had just walked out of the woods. His sneakers were caked in mud, his backpack slung over one shoulder, just like the one David Mercer was wearing the day he vanished. He was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Something about him was wrong, not just his sudden appearance. It was the fact that he looked exactly like the pictures I had seen in old newspaper clippings. He hadn't aged. Not a single day. I felt my stomach tighten. "Hey, kid. You okay?" He turned his head, locking eyes with me. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was hollow, like he was just waking up from a nightmare. "You're in Ashwood," I said carefully. "What's your name?" He hesitated. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "David. David Mercer." The room spun. I nearly dropped the box of chips in my hands. My brain immediately rejected it. This couldn't be real. David Mercer had been missing for 25 years. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, unchanged, and looking absolutely terrified. I stared at the boy for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to process the impossible. David Mercer, a child who had vanished without a trace over 2 decades ago, was standing in front of me, looking like he had just stepped out of the past. I managed to find my voice. "David, is that really you?" He nodded, his eyes glassy, unblinking. "I don't know how I got here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't remember anything. I didn't know how to react." Part of me wanted to shake him, to demand answers. The other part just wanted to run because this was wrong. I kept my distance, my hand hovering over the phone in my pocket, ready to call the police. But I couldn't move. It was like the air in the gas station had thickened. Every breath felt heavier than the last. And then, before I could speak again, he spoke first. I don't know why I came back," David said, his voice cracking. "But I remember walking into the fog, and it kept going deeper, like I couldn't escape. I couldn't see anything, but I kept walking, couldn't stop. And then," he faltered, his hands trembling as they clasped his backpack strap. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "There's something out there, in the fog. It's been waiting for me. I can feel it." My chest tightened. The fog. I had heard stories. All my life, I had heard the tale of the fog that had swallowed David Mercer. People said it was a curse, that the fog was a kind of prison, trapping those who wandered into it in a world between worlds. That was the story, anyway. But hearing it from David himself, it hit differently. He wasn't telling a story. He was living it. "David, what happened to you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked down at his shoes, his breath shaky. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. Time. It doesn't work the same in there. It's like you're stuck, but you're not. And I don't know if I was there for a minute or for years. But I couldn't get out. I couldn't leave until they let me go." His words hung in the air, thick with fear. I felt a cold sweat prick at the back of my neck. Who let you go? I asked. David's eyes met mine again, those wide, dark eyes. The ones in the fog, he whispered. They finally let me leave. But they said I had to bring someone back. Someone who would listen. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone like me? David didn't answer. His gaze shifted to the door, to the world outside. The night was quiet, but the fog, it was there. It had rolled in, thick and impenetrable, creeping toward the gas station like it had a purpose. I didn't know how long we stood there, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. My heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to help, to get David some answers, to take him somewhere safe. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was nowhere safe. I wasn't sure how, but I knew in that moment I was already a part of this. Without warning, the bell above the door rang again. I turned, and this time my blood ran cold. In the doorway stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its body was shrouded in fog, a dark, almost liquid-like mist that clung to the figure's form. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of something vaguely human, and the sickening sense that it was wrong, so wrong. It was like looking at a shadow that had been torn from the fabric of reality itself. David gasped, his face turning pale. "They're here." The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. His presence was all-consuming. I took a step backward, my hands shaking. "David, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But David just stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with something between fear and recognition. He didn't move, and I knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't going to leave. The figure in the fog didn't make a sound. But I could feel it, like its gaze was piercing through me, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. My legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by an unseen force. "What do they want?" I asked, barely able to speak. David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trembling, tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. The figure moved closer, gliding through the fog with eerie grace, and just when I thought it might step into the gas station, the door slammed open behind me. A bright light filled the room. For one insane moment, I thought the sun had come up. But it wasn't the sun, it was the headlights of a car. A local sheriff's car. The figure paused. And then, like smoke being blown away by the wind, it disappeared. I didn't wait to ask questions. I grabbed David's arm and pulled him out the door, running toward the sheriff's car. I didn't care that I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't care that everything in me screamed to look back. All I cared about was getting out of there. But as we approached the car, the sheriff's face was pale, his hands shaking. His mouth opened to speak, and then he looked past us toward the fog, and his eyes went wide with terror. "Oh no," he whispered. "It's back." I don't know how much time passed after that. It felt like minutes, but the world around us had changed so drastically in those moments that it could have been days. The sheriff's eyes were locked on the fog, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. His hands gripped the doorframe of his patrol car, his knuckles white. The heavy, unnatural silence hung in the air. I felt the cold wrap around me again, like a living thing, squeezing out every ounce of warmth. I turned to look at David, but he was staring at the sheriff, too, his face pale, his lips trembling. The fog seemed to pulse, as if it was alive. It rolled in thick waves, undulating like something with a heartbeat. "David?" I began, trying to steady my voice. "What's happening? What was that thing?" But David wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the sheriff. The sheriff's voice broke the silence, ragged, like he'd just woken from a terrible dream. "It's back. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have come." David took a step forward. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. I stared between the sheriff and David. "What the hell is going on?" The sheriff blinked rapidly, as if trying to shake something off. His breath came in sharp gasps, his voice now barely a whisper. "It's the fog. It's not just weather. It's something else. Something that traps people. People who walk in, like David, don't come out the same." I could feel my heart racing. Something else? Was this some kind of sick joke? David didn't speak. He didn't even seem to hear us. His eyes were empty, lost. I could see it now, he was being pulled toward the fog. There was a magnetism to it, like it had a hold on him, like it was calling him back. I reached out, grabbing his arm. "David, please, don't go back in there. It's not real." But when I touched him, I felt a chill that sank deep into my bones. He turned to look at me, those same unblinking, glassy eyes. I'm not going back." His voice trembled. "I never left. I can't leave." The fog moved again. It wasn't a slow roll anymore. It was surging, rushing toward us, its density swallowing the night. The wind picked up, sending the smell of wet earth and decay toward us. I could taste it in the back of my throat. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft rustling, like whispers carried by the wind. It wasn't coming from the trees. It wasn't coming from anywhere natural. The sheriff froze. He had heard it too. "It's them," he breathed, his voice shaking. "They're here." I turned my head sharply, looking back toward the edge of the woods. And then I saw them. Figures. Pale, wispy shapes moving within the fog. They didn't walk. They floated, drifting like shadows. Some were hunched over, others stood tall and still, their eyes just like David's, empty and unseeing. They didn't belong in the world I knew. They were fading in and out, like broken reflections in a cracked mirror. The fog was their domain. David didn't move when he saw them. He stood there, frozen, as if he had seen them before, as if they had called him here. One of the figures seemed to drift closer, its outline solidifying for a split second. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long matted hair that hung down like strands of black silk. It didn't have a face, not a real one anyway, just hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were filled with concrete. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed. The sheriff was shaking his head, muttering under his breath. "No, no, please," he was pleading now, his hands pressing against his forehead like he was trying to keep something out. And then, in the space between heartbeats, the fog swallowed him whole. He didn't scream. He didn't even try to fight it. He was gone just like that. "No!" I screamed, stumbling back. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. My eyes kept darting between David, the fog, and the place where the sheriff had been. But the phone was useless in my hand. No service, no signal, just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. David stood unmoving, staring at the fog. He didn't react to the sheriff's disappearance. And then I heard it, the whisper. It was soft, distant at first, but growing louder, clearer, until it was right behind me. "Come closer." I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing. No one behind me, but the whisper didn't stop. "Come closer." "You're not far, just a little farther. The fog will take you. You'll never leave." I felt my legs move before I could stop them. I was walking toward the fog. The figure's voice was too powerful, too persuasive. I couldn't resist it. I was almost at the edge when David spoke. His voice was strained, like he was barely holding on. "Don't." His words broke through the haze in my mind. "Don't go into the fog. It's a trap." I turned back to him, but my feet were still moving, the pull of the fog stronger now. "David!" I shouted, trying to break free, but it was like my feet were glued to the earth. David's voice became a desperate scream. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop it when it took me. "You're not strong enough. You don't understand. It will never let you go." And then, as if his words broke the spell, I stopped. I blinked, realizing I was at the edge of the fog. I was standing on the line between reality and something else, something I couldn't understand. I took a step back, but the fog didn't follow. The figures, the whispers, they were gone. I turned to David, but he was gone too. The fog had taken him again. The small town of Ashford was a place of secrets. Nestled on the edge of a thick forest and bordered by a tranquil lake, it had always been a quiet, almost idyllic spot. People rarely left, and those who did often came back, as if the town had a way of keeping its people close. But on the night of June 2nd, 1986, Something happened that shattered the illusion of safety forever. Margaret Hale, a 26-year-old schoolteacher, disappeared without a trace. She'd been walking home from the local diner after a late shift, carrying a small bag of groceries. The path she took was familiar, a narrow road that led from the diner to her home on the outskirts of Ashford, flanked by rows of old oak trees. She had never been late before, and she was always careful to lock her doors. So when she didn't show up that night, her absence was noticed almost immediately. Her friends and family became concerned after a few hours, and by morning a search began. The police scoured the town, calling in volunteers to help comb through the area. Her house was empty. Her car remained parked in the driveway, and the only thing out of place was her groceries, left sitting on the front steps as if she had been interrupted. A search of the woods near the lake turned up nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication of where she had gone or how she had vanished. It was as though she had just disappeared into thin air. Weeks passed. The case became a mystery, one of those stories that people would whisper about when they thought no one was listening. Some speculated that she had run away, though it didn't make sense. Margaret had been a beloved member of the community. She had no history of depression, no history of strange behavior. It didn't seem like she would just leave, especially not without telling anyone. But as the weeks turned to months, and the search came up empty, the whispers turned darker. People started to say that Margaret hadn't left at all, that something in Ashford had taken her. They talked about the lake that seemed to have a strange pull, the old church on the hill, and the whispers in the night that no one could quite explain. And still, no trace of Margaret Hale. The search for Margaret Hale had turned from frantic to hopeless. Weeks dragged into months, and the townspeople's hope began to dwindle. The police had exhausted every possible lead, and they had no reason to believe foul play was involved. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder if there was something beyond the physical world at play. I had grown up in Ashford, so I knew the legends. Every town had them. Most people dismissed them as folklore, but I always felt there was more to them than meets the eye. One of those stories centered around the old church perched on the hill just outside of town, an ancient stone structure that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its stained glass windows were cracked and shattered, its doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. The locals said the church was cursed. No one could agree on why, but everyone had their theories. Some believed it was the site of an old pagan ritual. Others said it had been built on the grounds of an ancient cemetery where people had been buried alive. The town had always avoided the place. In fact, I had never been up there in my life. But Margaret Hale, the curious, intellectual woman that she was, had spent hours studying local history. I remembered her talking to me about it once. She'd mentioned the church on the hill, how she thought there was something mysterious about it, something hidden in the old stones. I should have known then. I should have realized that she was drawn to it somehow. It was a cold evening in November 1986, 5 months after Margaret disappeared, when I decided to visit the church. I had reached the point where I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something about that church was key to her disappearance. It was stupid, maybe, but I needed answers. There was a strange pull in my gut, urging me toward the hill, as if something or someone had been waiting for me. The walk up the hill was eerie. The wind howled through the trees, the sound of dry branches scraping together echoing in the stillness of the night. The church loomed in front of me, darker than I remembered. Its silhouette was sharp against the sky, as if it had been waiting there for centuries, untouched by time. As I stepped closer, I noticed that the air felt different, thick, almost charged with an electric buzz that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was just about to push the rotting wooden door open when I heard something. A soft rustling sound, like footsteps coming from inside the church. My heart stopped for a moment. I froze, listening. The rustling turned into a voice, soft, muffled, but unmistakable. It was Margaret's voice. "Help me," she whispered. "Please help me." I recoiled, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't move. The voice wasn't loud enough to call for help, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, unable to leave the voice behind. The door creaked open with a terrible groan, revealing the dim interior of the church. I had heard rumors about the church being haunted, but I never thought it would be like this. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, but there was something else. A coldness, a weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the darkness that made the room seem oppressive. It was as if something was watching me. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I certainly didn't expect to find Margaret Hale's body. She was lying at the foot of the altar, her clothes torn and covered in dirt. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. She looked like she hadn't aged a day, like she was just sleeping, except for the hollow emptiness in her gaze. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. Standing around her were several figures, tall, unnaturally thin, shrouded in shadow. They were standing motionless, as though frozen in time, but there was an unmistakable malice in the air. It was as if they were part of the church, part of the darkness that had lived within its walls for centuries. I gasped, taking an instinctive step backward. The figures didn't move. They didn't even seem to notice me. I didn't know how, but I had the overwhelming sense that they knew exactly who I was, that they had been waiting for me. I turned to run, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. But as I glanced back, I could have sworn I saw Margaret's body shift, her eyes briefly locking onto mine. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice now sharp, desperate. "You're not meant to leave. None of us ever leave." I stumbled down the hill, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness of the church swallowed me whole, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures, the things that had been waiting, were following me. But when I turned around to look, there was nothing. The church was gone, swallowed by the trees and the mist, as if it had never been there at all. The night after I ventured into the church, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had changed. Inside me, within the town, in everything. Ashford was no longer the sleepy, quaint town I had once known. There was a tension in the air, a weight that pressed down on everything. The shadows seemed longer, darker, and I could have sworn the trees along the outskirts of town were whispering to one another, rustling with words that weren't meant for human ears. It was hard to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's vacant stare, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if the church had stolen the last piece of her soul. The haunting whisper of her voice echoed in my mind, warning me to stay away, telling me that there was no way out. The words kept repeating in my head, twisting like a nightmare I couldn't escape. "You're not meant to leave. None of us ever leave." I hadn't told anyone about what I saw in the church. Who would believe me? Who could I even trust? The sheriff? The townspeople? No, they would think I was losing my mind, and perhaps I wondered maybe I was. But as the days passed, something compelled me to find out more, to dig deeper. There was no way I could live with myself not knowing what had truly happened to Margaret, and what in God's name was happening to Ashford. The town's few remaining elders, who had lived here before the church was abandoned, had always been silent about the past. But that night, something inside me told me that I had to go to them. Old Man Calder, the oldest living resident of Ashford, had been known to sit alone by the fire in the corner of the local tavern, muttering to himself about things no one dared to ask. He was a relic, some said, of a time long gone. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I found him sitting alone in the dim corner of the tavern, nursing a glass of bourbon. His grizzled face was obscured by a long beard, his eyes hidden behind the thick lens of glasses that magnified his pupils to an unnerving size. He didn't look up when I sat down across from him. "You lookin' for the truth, girl?" he asked, his voice rough and dry, like he hadn't spoken in years. I nodded, swallowing my fear. "I need to know what happened to Margaret Hale. I need to know what's in that church." Old Man Calder's hand trembled as he set his drink down, his face suddenly weary. "You want the truth? You think you're ready for it?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a mere whisper. "That church wasn't always a church. It used to be something else. Something darker." His words struck me, but I didn't dare interrupt him. He continued, his voice barely above a murmur. "Long ago, before any of us were born, Ashford was built on an old settlement. The land was cursed. People came here to escape, but they didn't know what they were running from. The forest, the lake, and the land itself, they were all part of a ritual that had been started long before us. People who wanted to escape death. They found refuge in the old ways. In the old gods. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. What do you mean by old gods? Calder's eyes darkened, and he leaned back in his chair, almost as if he were afraid to speak the truth aloud. I shouldn't be telling you this. You should run, child, while you still can. He paused, collecting his thoughts, his eyes flickering nervously toward the tavern's door. There are ancient forces in these woods, things that feed on the living, things that pretend to be gods, but they're not. They want to keep you here. They want to take you. I could feel the weight of his words, but I pushed forward. What does it have to do with Margaret? Why is she gone? Calder's lips trembled as he spoke, the words spilling out like a confession. Margaret, she was never meant to leave. She got too close, that one. Too close to the truth. The church, the place where it all began, wasn't just a building. It was a portal, a gateway between this world and the ones beyond. The figures you saw in there, they're not spirits. They're not ghosts. They're something else. Something that's been here long before us. They were waiting for someone with her curiosity, her thirst for knowledge. I felt my stomach turn. My thoughts raced. So Margaret. She went to the church to find out more about the town's past? I asked, almost in disbelief. Calder nodded slowly, his hands shaking. She got too close, child. Too close to what lies beneath. She didn't know what she was getting into. He leaned in again, his voice barely a breath. They took her. They've always been waiting for someone like her. They won't let her go. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly, a chill ran through the air, and the dim lights of the tavern flickered. My breath caught in my throat. There was something in the room with us. Something cold, something that didn't belong. Calder's voice dropped to a whisper. You think you're the first one to go looking for answers? There have been others before you. People who were never seen again. And those who were never the same when they came back. You go up that hill again, you're not leaving the same way you came. I stood up abruptly, my heart hammering. The tavern door swung open with a sharp creak, and the cold wind from outside blew in, carrying with it the faintest whisper. Come back! The voice was so faint, but I recognized it. It was Margaret's voice. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt the weight of Calder's warning sink in. There was no turning back now. I had to find out the truth, even if it meant risking my life, even if it meant becoming part of the darkness that had consumed so many others. The fog on the hill was waiting. The fog that night was heavier than I had ever seen it. Thick, almost suffocating, it clung to everything. The trees, the ground, the air itself. It was as though the entire town of Ashford had been swallowed by an invisible force. I could barely see my hand in front of my face as I walked down the street, the faint glow of the streetlights casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I had to go back. I had to face whatever had taken Margaret Hale. There was no other choice. Not after everything I had learned from Calder. The old church on the hill, the figures in the shadows, the cursed land beneath our feet. They were all tied together in a way I hadn't understood until now. I couldn't explain it, but something was calling me. It wasn't just the pull of curiosity. It was something deeper, more primal. The land, the fog, the church, they were waiting for me. I could feel it in my bones, in the air that seemed to grow heavier with each step I took. The fog wrapped itself around me, curling in waves, as though it were alive. As I approached the base of the hill, I could see the silhouette of the church through the mist, its outline barely visible in the pale moonlight. The air was colder here, almost biting. I hesitated for a moment, my breath caught in my throat, before I began the climb. The path was familiar yet different somehow, as if the land itself had changed since my last visit. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky, and the ground beneath my feet was slick with dew. Every step I took felt as if I were walking deeper into something ancient, something that did not want me to leave. The The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the thick fog, and I could swear I heard whispers riding the wind, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to be coming from all directions. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking, as though the entire forest was alive and watching me. I reached the church and stopped at the edge of the steps. It looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries. Its stone walls cracked and weathered, the roof sagging under the weight of time. The door creaked open without resistance, just like the last time. But this time, the air inside seemed different. It was thicker, more oppressive, as though something was pushing against me, trying to stop me from entering. I stepped inside. The smell of rot and mildew was overwhelming, and the air felt heavy, as though it were charged with a dark energy. The room was bathed in shadow, the light from outside barely filtering through the cracks in the stained glass windows. The altar, once a place of worship, now seemed like a sacrifice table, its worn stone surface stained with something I couldn't identify. And then I saw it. Margaret Hale was lying at the foot of the altar, her body still and unnaturally rigid. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted and damp. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, unblinking. She was still alive, at least I hope she was, but she didn't look the same. It was as though whatever force had taken her had changed her, had drained her of something essential. The figures were there, too, standing in the same positions as before, shrouded in shadow. There were more of them now, at least 6 or 7, all standing like silent sentinels, their faces obscured, their forms unnaturally tall and thin. The air seemed to pulse around them, as though they were breathing, as though they were alive in some strange, otherworldly way. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Margaret's eyes shifted, slowly, deliberately, until they locked onto mine. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, but it was quickly replaced with fear. Her lips parted, and she whispered the words that I had been dreading to hear. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, my body rigid with terror. The words were soft, but they carried with them a weight I couldn't understand. She didn't speak again. Her eyes seemed to plead, but at the same time, they were filled with a knowing sorrow, as though she understood something I hadn't yet grasped. I couldn't leave now. I needed answers. Before I could take another step, the air around me grew cold, unbearably cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The figures were moving. Not physically, no, their shapes seemed to melt and stretch, as though they were shifting between worlds. I could feel them closing in around me, their presence pressing in from all sides. I could hear their breathing, deep and unnatural, like a dozen voices all speaking at once. Then the whispering began. It was quiet at first, a murmur just on the edge of hearing. But it grew louder, until it filled the room, drowning out all other sounds. It was a language I couldn't understand, an ancient tongue, full of intensity, full of a strange alien power. The voices were all around me, speaking to each other, speaking through me, as if they were reaching deep inside my mind. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though the church itself had taken hold of me, paralyzing me in place. The figures, now fully visible, began to circle me, their long, pale fingers reaching out toward me. Their faces were still obscured by shadow, but I could feel their eyes, cold, empty, and knowing. Then, through the chaos of whispers, I heard something else. "Help me." The voice was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Margaret. She was trying to speak to me. I could feel her pain, her desperation. She was still in there, trapped within whatever dark force had claimed her. "You have to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They won't let you go. They'll never let you go." The figures around me began to reach for me, their hands cold and clammy as they brushed against my skin. The fog outside began to churn, swirling in a violent gust, and the temperature dropped further, until I was sure I couldn't feel my limbs. The church had become a prison, a cage, and I was trapped within it. But then, with a violent snap, the figures stopped. They froze, their hands inches from my body. The air grew still and the whispers fell silent. In that moment, I felt a sudden clarity, a strange understanding of what had been happening all along. These figures weren't just waiting for Margaret. They had been waiting for me. I was their next victim. I didn't have much time. I had to escape. And yet, as I turned to flee, I heard Margaret's voice one last time, softer now but full of resignation. You won't be able to leave. No one ever does. I didn't look back.